Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third in our series of webinars on the impact of climate change on sustainable economic development in Latin America and Nicaragua. My name is Joe DiNicola. I'm the Executive Director of Sostenica, the host for this webinar series. Sostenica integrates educational and environmental programs with financial services, a holistic approach necessary to address the root causes of poverty in rural Nicaragua. We have been active there since the 1990s, working primarily with agricultural communities. The concepts that will be discussed today, agroecology, permaculture, and regenerative agriculture, are at the core of our work with smallholder farmers in the dry corridor of northwestern Nicaragua. Before I introduce Jono, I want to briefly mention a few housekeeping items. The webinar will be recorded, and a link to the recording will be made available to all registrants. We'll aim to leave at least 20 minutes at the end of the presentation for your questions. You should have a menu option at the bottom of your screen to submit written questions. And at the end of the presentation, we'll go through as many of these as possible. If you include your email address, we'll respond by email to any questions we don't answer on the call. This afternoon, we are very happy to have Jono Neiger with us. Jono is a founding principal of the Regenerative Design Group, an advisory firm that helps individuals, institutions, and communities create functional, productive, and regenerative landscapes. He has more than 30 years of experience in the practice of agroforestry, permaculture, land management, conservation, and restoration. Jono is the author of the Permaculture Promise. He has much to share with us today, so let's get on with it. Jono, thanks for sharing your time with us today.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Joe. And thanks, Sostenica, for having me here. This is really an honor to be supporting your work in Nicaragua. And so we're going to cover a lot of ground here and talk about permaculture, regenerative agriculture. How does that impact climate change? How can we use that as a tool for climate change and more sustainable development? As Joe mentioned, my work with Regenerative Design Group, we cover a broad range of work areas, working from campuses in the States to urban green infrastructure here in the upper right, implementing a rain garden at an urban farm in Springfield, Massachusetts, to productive landscapes or productive conservation in buffer zones. And also working a lot in regenerative agriculture and supporting the food and farm community, which we'll talk more about. So beginning with what is permaculture, and the permaculture is a whole suite of ideas and approaches, but this is a little bit of a distillation, as permaculture is the integration of landscape and people provide for their food, energy, shelter, all of these things and more in a sustainable way. So really it's about how do we put it all together and make our systems work more holistically, more sustainably. It's grounded by ethics, 3 different ethics as touchstones to go back to and make sure that we're going the right direction. And the first one is earth care, taking care of all life systems to continue and increase, protection, regeneration, and reducing our human use. The second part is people care, caring for each other. How do we take care of our families, our communities, and then also self-care, taking care of ourselves as part of it. The third part of this is resource share, and that is we're meeting our own needs. And as we generate surplus with these abundant systems, we're investing in the future. We're spreading that surplus into our communities. So the ethics are a really important grounding for permaculture. And the principles are really design guidance as we work to develop these kinds of systems. There's a whole series of principles. Lots of different ways they're put together. In this case, it's just a sampling from David Holmgren, who developed some of the initial permaculture ideas with Bill Mollison. And so you can see kind of a few different ones, beginning really with observation We observe where we are, and really trying to understand place, reducing and eliminating waste and just cycling nutrients and materials through a system, catching and storing energy. We'll talk a little bit more about design from patterns to details, but other principles are using and value diversity. We need to maintain diversity and think about edges as a valuable part of the ecosystem, and has a lot of potential there. So the principle design from patterns and details, permaculture really is fundamentally a design system, a perspective, and the way we think about place, our place, understanding what is happening in a place. This is ecological design, permaculture design. So we get a sense of the patterns that are happening there, what's happening with movement, the form of the land, what kind of land use, and what's happening with the use of space. So we're really trying to understand a place and begin our activities from that place of understanding of the land, of its history, of the ecological history, what are the constraints and what are the opportunities, and work from there to design and plan our farms, our homesteads, our community activities from that place of understanding. So we're not just imposing our will, we're actually working with the land. So permaculture is also a whole systems design. It's really how do we put all the pieces together, including food and water, ecosystems and wildlands, energy, shelter, transportation systems, and really at the center is a community and our commerce and activities with each other. So moving on from permaculture, we move into the zone of how do we create productive ecosystems, and how do we generate yields and the surplus. And so regenerative agriculture flows out of this design and planning on the land, and regenerative agriculture has several different goals or principal focuses. And the first one is improving ecosystem health. So it's a development of an agriculture that's really a beneficial and healing practice on the land. It's a agriculture that's part of the solution. And so the areas of ecosystem health that we're focused on, of course, begins with soil, the depth of the soil, the fertility of the soil's ability to filter and support cropping, its ability to sequester carbon, and do all these other things that we need it to do. So additionally is water, an important part of the ecosystem, and what can regenerative agriculture do to improve the water conditions on the land, where this picture is showing a water system without any kind of buffering. It's likely that there are nutrients flowing into the waterway. It's likely that that there's damage happening to the water. Instead of this, in regenerative agriculture, we're looking at improving and building and helping the system to work better by filtering fresh water and buffering these kind of land uses with the nutrient flows going there. So the third part of ecosystem health is biodiversity, is creating habitat within the agriculture that we're developing, having buffers and edges and kind of those messy zones and edge zones that are used by numerous different creatures that are also helping to do pest control, to help cycle nutrients, to help do pollination, all those functions that are important for the agriculture and important for the wider ecosystem. So that's just the first goal there. And the second goal of regenerative agriculture is to sequester carbon, is to bring carbon out of the atmosphere and get it down into the soil. And here on the left is Jerry Glover from the Land Institute, where they're experimenting with developing perennial grain crops, and you can see the root depth on the left of the perennial wheatgrass there, the annual wheats on the right with a very minimal rooting system. And so this is the power of that carbon sequestration, and the sort of corollary to that, the connected piece of that, is that the more we can use perennials in developing this regenerative agriculture and less annuals, not that we're going to do away with all annual agriculture anytime soon, but we can begin to incorporate perennials more and more. And the way this root system of a tree is putting its roots deep down into the soil, and it's sequestering carbon in a whole different pool, a deeper, longer term carbon pool, where that's the carbon sequestration that is really important. And shout out to J. Russell Smith, who wrote Tree Crops, Permanent Agriculture in the 20s, and really laid out some of the groundwork, fundamental groundwork of utilizing tree crops. The fourth part, a goal of regenerative agriculture really is, although it's the fourth one here, it's also a primary goal, is to build resilience for farmers, farms, and communities, and help nurture what is a really difficult, challenging business, challenging to provide food and all the other things that farms need. And so this regenerative agriculture, where we're developing healthy systems, and the multi-cropping here is growing cacao with sugar palm. This is in a diverse agroforest, in this case in Ghana and West Africa, and really helping to build the ability of farms to provide for their own needs, to deal with downturns or crop loss, and be able to take care of their own needs in a much more vibrant way. So the challenge really is that there is so much degraded land. Regenerative agriculture, carbon farming have this opportunity to address and restore much of this degraded land. It's estimated that globally there's between 800 million and over 1 billion acres of degraded agricultural land. And so there's a huge need and a huge opportunity to bring this land back into fertility and health and function, ecological function, and at the same time being able to supply for the needs of the farmers and the communities in the surrounding area. And so what's the role that regenerative agriculture can play in this? And so there's a whole toolkit of different practices that regenerative agriculture brings to this that can sequester carbon and do ecosystem restoration. And so there's agroforestry practices, which we'll talk about a little bit more. In addition, we mentioned perennial cropping, rotational grazing is very important, conservation farming practices, hedgerows and windbreaks, swales and ponds, biochar. These are all different pieces, different tools that can be used in different ways, can be applied in, and they're not all appropriate in every situation, but can help sort of move the farm along to where it is sequestering carbon and improving soil health, and also restoring the ecosystem function. So one suite of those practices that we'll focus on now for a little bit is agroforestry, and which is a whole number of different practices, all that are the intentional mixing of trees and or shrubs into crop and animal production systems, creating environmental, economic, and social benefits. So we're putting the pieces together. As I mentioned, with permaculture is about integrating these parts in a sort of a design thinking kind of way. Agroforestry is a really good example of that, of kind of a designed system where we're really thinking about how can our how can our agriculture be more like an ecosystem? It's not completely like an ecosystem, but we're putting the parts together that mutually support each other. So agroforestry has a number of different practices within it. Beginning to the upper left is alley cropping, where you have rows of trees, and then you grow crops in the alleyways, and silvopasture, where you're growing the trees of forest with a wide spread open canopy and grazing of livestock underneath. And you're getting the benefits of both the tree crop overstory and the grazing understory. Forest farming, where you're growing within gaps and openings in a existing forest, doing non-timber forest products like mushrooms, medicinal herbs, culinary herbs, those kinds of things that can be harvested while you're maintaining the forest and forest health. Riparian forest buffers are a practice of buffering the other land uses that are further from a river or a wetland zone, a sensitive ecological zone, and still managing it for certain suitable uses. It could be nut trees or berries. It could be cutting for biomass or firewood, etc. But it's a buffered zone along the edge of riverways primarily. And windbreaks are another practice, which are field edges that are blocking wind, so reducing stress on crops or livestock, but they're also functioning in multiple ways, whether it's producing a fruit crop, a fodder crop, or pollinator strip, supporting ecological activity and movement corridors for wildlife. Can be working in lots of different ways on the landscape. So thinking about these agroforestry strategies and carbon sequestration, what is the promise there? What's the potential? There's been some calculations by Kumar and Nair in their book, Carbon Sequestration, Potential of Agroforestry Systems. And there's some pretty amazing numbers of acreages in these agroforestry practices already. For instance, 4.17 million acres in riparian buffer. Estimated carbon sequestration right now is 4.7 teragrams of carbon per year. And in alley cropping systems, there's 44.2 million acres. This is in the United States that are sequestering 60.9 teragrams of carbon per year. Silvopasture, even more, 192 million acres. And that's including, these are estimates that include some portion of grazed forest and the 10% of pasture land that has some element of a tree crop growing up and over it, and 474 teragrams of carbon per year. Windbreaks protecting cropland and farmsteads are estimated to be sequestering 8.8 teragrams of carbon per year. And so the total estimated is 548 teragrams of carbon per year. So this is offsetting approximately 34% of US emissions, which are estimated at 1,600 teragrams of carbon per year. So we're seeing that this already, agroforestry is a practice that is doing this work on the landscape and has a lot of potential to be increased as well. So some example of mitigating climate change and what the promise here is increasing the soil carbon just 5% in the top 12 inches on arable land in the US could offset historic carbon releases. So this is working on the soil storage in the top layers of the soil, working on that carbon storage that is somewhat more in flux, the top layers of the soil versus the deeper down carbon that gets stored further down is considered more of a long-term store. but it still has the ability to offset a huge amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere and pull it out. So it's quite a potential there. So another project calculating and trying to understand the potential of reversing global warming, reversing this carbon buildup and reducing what's going in is Project Drawdown. Highly recommend folks take a look at this project, which lays out the top 100 solutions to sequester, reduce carbon output, and sequester carbon. And for our purposes today, this pie chart is showing the top solutions, and the agriculture, regenerative agriculture, and agroforestry are 7 of the top 30, beginning with number 7, silvopasture, regenerative agriculture, tropical staple trees, conservation agriculture, tree intercropping, which is alley cropping, and farmland restoration, and multi-strata agroforestry are all solutions within this suite that we've been talking about that have this high potential to sequester carbon and reverse global warming. I highly recommend you taking a look at the website, and the book is pretty amazing as well. So let's look a little bit at what kinds of practices are being used in tropical systems as well. I'm thinking that I might have missed a slide here. I'm going to go back. Oh, I had a slide that got bumped out, but this is an example of tropical agroforestry. And in Mexico at Las Cañadas, this is an alder silvopasture where the livestock are grazing underneath alder, which do some nitrogen fixation, and they're also providing fodder, they're providing shade for the livestock and improving the ability of the pasture to be greener and less stressed in the heat in the dry, hot season. So we're getting benefits both to the grazing by the trees, benefits to the pasture, and less stress on the livestock, as well as some products from the trees as well. So we're getting benefits on both sides. This is a silvopasture. The other systems I was going to mention are some very large scale use of breadfruit and artocarpus species that creates a multi-story perennial agroforestry, primarily in the Pacific Islands, but also in spreading into Central America, South America, Caribbean. There's there's systems of using species Erythrina indica to shade coffee and supporting black pepper growing up on the trunks. And that's in India. In Ethiopia and parts of sub-Saharan Africa, there's the use of Faidherbia albida as a permanent crop that grows over cereals and vegetables and coffee. So there's a lot of diverse different systems. Tropics have, there's some old, very deep cultural connected tropical agroforestry systems, and maybe a little less so in the temperate zone, but not completely. So some examples of agroforestry in the temperate zone that go back quite deep. In Spain, the Dehesa, and called the Montado in Portugal, is a silvopastoral system based on these several oak species, the cork and holm oak, and as well as others, with livestock grazing underneath. And primarily, or at least most notably, the Iberian pigs, which create this very prized ham, the jamón ibérico, and other non-timber forest products in there as well, such as honey, firewood, mushrooms, and wild game that are using this system. So it's ecologically very diverse and culturally very important, and really producing this very prized ham. Another temperate zone project is this, closer to home, is at the University of Illinois. They've developed this agroforestry for food, agroforestry trialing, testing all sorts of different multifunctional woody polyculture configurations, and for the potential as an alternative to this soy corn agriculture in the Midwest. And so it's pretty exciting. There's some results coming out of that. It's set up for long-term testing, and I think it has a lot of promise for pushing agroforestry in a larger scale in the U.S. and the Midwest. Some cultural landscape of the hedgerows here in the UK, you can just kind of see how important these edge zones are, these hedgerows as windbreaks, as the potential to provide fodder, firewood, locations for pollinators that are supporting the farm activities. So this kind of hedgerow landscape, which has been lost in many places, including the U.S. and the Midwest agriculture, but it holds a lot of promise, and there's a lot of potential for redeveloping that. So one example of a windbreak is this kind of basket willow. These are old species that were selected for fine basketry with less branching. They're managed through coppice. You can see the coppice pieces down below, different kinds of colors and textures. This is the stools of the coppice have the ability to live very, very long periods of time. They grow back each year 3 to 6 feet, providing us material that can be used and brought in as a weaving material, a fencing material, a biomass or biochar material. Can be used in lots of different ways, as well as being part of an edge zone of a farm. And an example of a forest farming, utilizing the understory, in this case, the golden seal cultivation under butternut forest. So we're getting both medicinals in the understory, forest medicinals, and also a nut crop that's available. So a really nice, simple system, quite beautiful. This is the farm project that I'm developing in Massachusetts, Big River chestnuts, where we've planted 7 acres of hybrid Chinese chestnuts, blight-resistant chestnuts, and we're in a buffer zone along the Connecticut River. So in the aerial photo, that's the Connecticut River on the left there. The rows are the chestnut trees, and then in the alleyways, we are planting right now a variety of different crops, including elderberry, aronia, persimmon, and pawpaw, that will be growing in those alleys and developed as a early and mid-succession crop. And then we'll have chickens as well that will be ranging through the alleyways. And so trying to do the different kinds of layered cropping, as well as these different kinds of practices, regenerative soil practices, inoculations of the soil for soil biology, and bringing in cover crops and developing the biomass and improving the soil for the growth of all the trees and the other crops as well. So that's in development. So just a little bit about what are some of the barriers to adoption of these kinds of practices, regenerative agriculture and agroforestry, which are really different in some places, though we looked at some examples of some very old systems or culturally intact and systems that have been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But in our culture, in the U.S., the perception of these kinds of systems, they're very unfamiliar. We have grazers who spend a lot of time keeping trees out of pastures, and we have a lot of forest managers who are not keen on having animals in the forest. And so how do we bring these practices together where we're trying to integrate livestock and trees and such? So it's very unfamiliar. That's one problem. There's some specialized knowledge that's required, some skills and understanding what's a suitable number of animals in a silvopasture, or what's the spacing of an alley crop, or what's a succession sequence of developing a alley cropping or even a food forest situation. So there needs to be a lot more research, a lot more sites where this is happening. That's growing right now. It's a really exciting time where there's a lot of people experimenting and setting up systems, but it's not. It needs to be more visible. It needs to get out there more, and I think that we're seeing that start to happen. Another fairly large barrier is the cost of getting these kinds of systems established, and the cost of using these kinds of practices. It's long term. You might be thinking, if you're planting a tree crop, and it could be 5 to 8 years before you really start to turn it around and become profitable. That's a long time to ask farmers to wait. And so there's different strategies there where there could be some cost sharing with NRCS or state agriculture agencies. There's a lot of farms that just do a bootstrapping kind of system where they're putting some tree crops around edges, or taking one field out, or putting some in at a time. So just sort of slowly bringing some of these different kinds of practices in, sort of a process of diversifying and building these kinds of things. Another barrier is there's some risks involved. The challenge of some people trying to get into this where they don't have a long-term tenure on a property. So if you're just leasing, then you're challenged by being sure that you can have access to the land over a long period of time if you're putting a long-term system in, and then just the learning curve again that's required to get established and going. So a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunity as well at the same time. All right, well, we've covered quite a bit of ground and covered a lot of things fairly quickly, and I'd love to hear any questions or thoughts that anybody has.
Great. Jono, that was really, really helpful overview. Let me just start by reminding, because we had a number of people that joined the webinar after the introduction, but you do have a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions, you can choose the Q&A button, type your question in. I will be reading the questions out loud for the group, and either Jono or I will try to provide an answer where we can. And Jono, we have one initial question that came in while you were talking, and it was specific to that photo that you had of the Big River chestnut site in Massachusetts. And the question is, are there any field tours or any access to that property that's made available? And I guess I'd broaden the question to say maybe you can share with us a few sites in the Northeast that are good places to see permaculture on the ground.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. Let's see, at Big River Chestnuts, we are definitely starting to set up some tours. The photo from the middle here is an initial tour last year. Our first time really getting people out and showing people around. I would say the best way is to if you email me, if people are interested, email me and I will keep you posted on the next opportunity to get out there. We'll probably be doing something in July. Yeah, we're actually busy planting right now, getting more things in the ground in the crazy spring rush. There are a lot of different places, experimental places, demonstration sites just in our area. There's a series of sites setting up chestnut agroforestry, the Ag Learning Center at UMass Amherst. It's got a very small silvopasture trial going. I would say call out to the Small Farms program at Cornell, and you could look them up. And there's a group there, including Ken Mudge and Steve Gabriel, that are doing experiments and research and demonstration, including the McDaniel's Nut Grove, which was planted in the 1930s and neglected for a long time and then rediscovered. Permaculture sites, just all over. I would point you to the Permaculture Association of the Northeast as a good resource. For the goal at the Permaculture Association of the Northeast, or PAN, is to develop a database of sites. That's still in development right now. Again, send me a note, and if you're something specific that you're looking for, whether it's a small farm homestead or it's more of a natural building or agroforestry, I could try and point you in the right direction.
Great. And Jono, the second question that we have is similar in this, but they're looking for examples on public land, so either parklands or U.S. forest, that are demonstrating these alternative agricultural practices. Are there any that come to mind?
Let's see. Yeah, I think that there's quite a few. I mean, I think it ranges from the urban farm situation where we're working on a few urban farms in combination with the Urban Farm Institute and Trust for Public Lands. One is called the Fowler Clark Epstein House in Boston. There's a food forest, fairly large scale food forest project in Seattle. I think it's somewhere around 10 acres in a very public setting, developing these kind of multi-cropping integrated food forest. Yeah, I think that's what comes to mind right now.
Okay, one of our attendees has suggested the Wellesley College Permaculture Garden, which is, I guess, private property but open to the public, and that's close by.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great example on a campus where we were involved in that for a number of years, setting up demonstration plots and small experimental plots, and then the students have taken on research on that as well. I think just bringing up campuses, the UMass Amherst has some interesting things happening as well. Gardens on campus for both production and demonstration.
Excellent. Changing gears a little, the next question reads, thinking specifically about climate change, has the IPCC integrated any of these concepts of carbon capture in their recommendations?
Yes, there's a lot of attention through the IPCC in agroforestry, for sure. Agroforestry is floating as far as agriculture goes, and agricultural strategies is floating up as a really powerful tool that can be part of the solution, can definitely be part of pulling out carbon that's in the atmosphere, getting it down into the soil and into the longer term soil storage. So yes, I believe that internationally there's a lot of recognition, and we're seeing more and more interest work right now happening, trying to understand how this is working, how the carbon storage is working, how to connect the different practices that farmers use, practices that improve soil health, and which ones are the highest leverage for storing carbon in the soil, which ones are the strongest, or how can we measure these different practices and measure the results from them. So there's a lot of work happening in the technical side of things to be able to understand and then be able to support better practices.
All right, and a somewhat related question is what is the smallest land area that you would suggest is adequate for the application of these concepts? And probably a wide range of ways to answer that question, but Jono, why don't you take a stab, and then I have some thoughts as well.
Yeah. That's interesting. I would say that the from a food production and self-sufficiency and community development and leading to more resilience, you can use very small areas, from small backyards, to even community garden plots that can be part of this, even if it's a very small part, even if it's about reaching your children or children in the community and being able to see these things in practice. I think that from a small backyard plot up can be very powerful. As far as carbon storage and really getting to the carbon sequestration, I think that we're really needing to have hundreds, if not thousands, of acres. So it's definitely, there's a desire to scale up into larger acreage in order to get the real leverage of the carbon sequestration. But so many farmers around the world are farming, a hectare or several hectares, 2 to 5 acres, or up to 10 acres, that these solutions and practices are super important for that scale of a farmer, and the ability to diversify, the ability to have some positive ecological effects as well.
That's a good answer. And the only thing I'd add to that, Jono, is I think a lot of it depends on the practice. And in one of your earlier slides, you had a broad list of practices. And so clearly things like agroforestry, pasturing, some of those things require much larger plots of land in many cases. But as you say, for a small home garden, you can readily substitute some more the perennial crops for the annuals very easily in just a very small plot of land, and as well as many other practices. So you don't need a lot of land to implement many of these ideas.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's even valuable to have small demonstration or practice plots of these kinds of things happening, and particularly in forest gardens or food forests, where you can in a small woodland area be experimenting with woodland medicinals or ramps or mushroom logs, and even something like mushroom logs that could be happening in urban forests or urban farm situation. So they're definitely scalable. Some of these things are very scalable, going down and going up as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Staying on the topic of carbon storage, how well understood is the potential for regenerative agriculture to store carbon in soils and below ground biomass? How much data and research has been done in that?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, the reference that I put up, the Kumar and Nair agroforestry potential for carbon sequestration, is a great resource for that of research. There's I would say that, and even they talk a lot about this, that our understanding of the potential for carbon storage, how this kind of carbon storage works, and which practices are either better or more effective, is really early. It's really we're just understanding some of the answers to those questions. The challenge being that different researchers are using different parameters, different ways to measure carbon storage, and slightly different metrics, and that the variability of the land is so huge. And so there's a challenge that if you're using the same measurements on different land, you're going to get very different results just from small differences in topography, soil types, the way the water is moving. So I think that there's a lot of work happening right now, and it's improving our understanding of carbon storage. There's some really interesting work we've been tracking closely. The NOFA, Northeast Organic Farm Association, carbon proxy tests that are different measurements, partly of soil health and partly of soil carbon, that are meant to be indicators that if these practices are working, the soil is improving, and we aren't 100% measuring the deep carbon storage, but we're understanding that the topsoil is increasing, the percentage of carbon in the top layer of the soil is increasing, the biological activity of the soil is increasing, and the presumption right now is that means that there's a longer term carbon storage happening. So that's one strategy that is happening with soil testing, is to do a whole range of different soil tests to try and understand the progress or what kind of changes are happening under different kinds of practices, whether you're using livestock or rotational grazing, whether you're doing tree crops or alley cropping, what kind of changes are happening in the soil, and then are they telling us something, are they indicators for the carbon sequestration that's happening, and hopefully indicators for the deeper layers of carbon storage that the trees and perennials are able to produce. And that's something I've sort of touched on a little bit, but the important, there's there's different kinds of cycles within the carbon cycle, and there's fast carbon cycling that happens with plants as they're pulling carbon out, and they're using it to build their structures. And then there's deeper pools of carbon that are down deep in the soil, or even in a tree that's going to last hundreds of years. So these are all different variables and factors that need to be considered, and it's definitely not all figured out. We don't know everything we need to know, and I'm a believer that we need to keep moving forward and using regenerative agriculture and agroforestry practices, even as we're trying to understand better what we should be doing.
And Jono, would you say is it accurate to say that there's quite a bit of academic research in this area? I know that in the work we're doing in Nicaragua, we are partnering with universities to try to quantify some of these changes. My sense is that's broadly applicable, that we're seeing research throughout the world trying to better understand the impact of these sorts of systems.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So I mentioned pretty briefly the University of Illinois setting up these long-term trials. I think the challenge with some of the agriculture we're talking about, where it's not just a year-by-year annual agriculture, it demands a longer-term tracking. And so it's a challenge for the academic community to set up longer term research, longer term trials, even to where it's going to be decades, so we can understand what's happening and which practices are actually leading to longer term changes. So there's a lot happening. There's some long-term trials that I've been hearing about. University of Illinois, the University of Missouri, Cornell are some in the U.S. that come to mind. And I have to also say that even in the sort of the more in the setting up pilot projects, or where it's not as formal a research, but we're having a number of places that are trying lots of different things, and there's able to learn maybe in the edges of the academic community, and the importance of farmers being able to see other farmers doing these kind of projects and trying out different things means is a huge opportunity to reach more people too. So I think that it's important that it's in the academic research is growing, which it is, and then also that we continue to get it out into the community and farm communities, and have more and more visible projects. So we're getting to it from all different sides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one more question on carbon storage. And it reads, I was very impressed by the statistic of 5% carbon increase in the soil of the arable land. Where does biochar fit into this idea of carbon capture?
That's a really good question. I think biochar has a lot of promise. Biochar is essentially carbon. It's essentially form of charcoal that is, if not 100%, it's almost completely carbon. And our understanding from the temperate soils in South America and the carbon dating of those is that those are that's biochar or charcoal that's been there for hundreds, or I think 1,000 years or more, and is so super stable carbon in the soil. And in fact, in those soils where they had developed over a long period of time, and the biochar is very deep and a very high percentage of the soil, was hugely affecting the soil fertility. So we're getting that same kind of thing with this regenerative agriculture, where the solutions that we have are both helping out environmentally, it's holding carbon in the soil, but it's also producing this incredibly fertile soil. So in this tropical areas of South America, you're having these zones where the terra preta is, the biochar, that have super high levels of fertility over hundreds of years period, which is pretty amazing. So I think that another area where there's a lot of research happening, a lot of trialing, so we can understand it more, what the potential of the biochar is, and so I would say it's a definitely a solution, a tool that should be used, and we should understand it more, and we should keep setting up more trials so we can see the results of it in different situations with different kinds of crops as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now we have a different kind of question, and this is a broad one that is probably going to be a challenge to answer succinctly. But the question is, what is the productivity in calories per acre of permaculture systems compared to traditional agricultural systems?
Oh, nice. I like this because it's sort of bringing, I don't want to minimize the need to measure and to know that. And so on the one hand, I would be right up there in recognizing that a lot of permaculture practitioners have the propensity to oversell maybe, or to overestimate what the benefits are going to be without going through the work and the time that it takes to set these kinds of systems up. The second part of that, I would say, is that as I was kind of introducing permaculture as a design and thinking, planning system, it's really how we put all the pieces together. I kind of resist even the idea that this is a permaculture garden, this is a permaculture house or homestead. It's permaculture is a series of principles, a series of a way of looking at things and way of trying to bring in more integration and interconnection. And so, we're using practices that go beyond that, whether it's agroforestry or agroecology, biodynamics, use of cover crops, the use of deep rooting, soil improving crops. So it's a little hard in my mind to isolate a specific place and say this is a permaculture site versus this is a site that's using permaculture principles, and the practices are indicated through the design and planning. So I'm not trying to squeeze out of that. It's a good question. I would try and get to that. I don't have any data specifically on calories per acre. And I think it would be interesting to see. There was some research, Rafter Ferguson, who did some research on permaculture inspired or permaculture designed farms. Also at the University of Illinois, his doctorate work to try and understand how the practices informed by permaculture changed the way these farms operated and how did they improve them. I'm not sure that he was measuring productivity by calories per acre.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jono. It's a very complex subject for many of the reasons that you describe, and also because often these systems are designed, with perennial crops, so that the measurement on a single year basis can be a difficult comparison to make to a standard annual cropping system. But going to your point regarding these are really principles, one of the things that we observe in Nicaragua is that applying these principles, a lot of what we deal with is water limitations. And so we're applying principles to overcome the existing system limitations, and that significantly allows us to increase productivity of the land by extending the growing season, by making water more available, improving soils so that they store water and extend the growing season. So a lot of these practices are not, it's not a complete replacement of an existing system, but it's adopting concepts that allow existing systems or existing approaches to increase their productivity directly, because that's really often the primary objective of a small farmer is how much more can they produce on their land and how much income can they increase with a new approach. And what we find is that it's directly measurable to assess the increase in production by applying a better way of conserving water and improving soil. But it's a very complicated question, and I would encourage the person who asked the question to follow up with either of us. There is a lot of literature that we can point you to, but it's not an easy question to answer in a couple minutes.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks. I do appreciate the question, and it sort of points to the complexity of these systems that we're working in, and on the one hand, our desire to understand them in a technical sense, but it is the results of how much food, how much yield is coming off of them, and that's really what we're trying to get, both the yield and the livelihood of the people who are living on.
And Jono, I think we're out of time. So I want to thank you for your time and thank everyone for participating. And again, if you want to hear a recording of this, it will be available online. We'll be sharing that with everyone shortly. So Jono, thank you again.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Bye now.